Welcome to Amusing Jews, where we celebrate Jewish contributors and contributions to American popular culture. I'm Jonathan Friedmann.
And I'm Joey Angelfield.
Producer-engineer Mike Tomren is working somewhere behind the scenes. Amusing Jews is a project of Adat Chaverim Congregation for Humanistic Judaism, the Jewish Museum of the American West, and Atheists United Studios. Hey, Joey, if you were in Paris in 1928, you would have heard about Maria Lani, a Polish-born Jew masquerading as a German actress who is determined to be immortalized in paintings by the greatest artists of the day. This fascinating, twisting, tumultuous story is the subject of a new graphic novel by today's guests.
We're happy to chat with Jonathan Lackman, an author and art historian, and Zachary J. Pinson, an artist and illustrator, whose new book, The Woman with 50 Faces, Maria Lani and the Greatest Art Heist That Never Was, is published by Fantagraphics. Jonathan and Zach, welcome to Amusing Jews.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
For members of our audience unfamiliar with Maria Lani, as I was before I read your book, who was she and what was her impact on the art world?
She showed up in Paris in 1928, presenting herself as a silent film star from Berlin at work on a movie about an art collector, and insinuated to various artists that she met that if they were to do a portrait of her, this portrait might appear in her next movie, and wouldn't that be nice? And in this fashion, she racked up over 50 portraits. All the great artists of the day practically were living in Paris, and most of them signed on to do a portrait. So we're talking Matisse, Chagall, Soutine, Man Ray, Braque, Leger. I could go on and on. Lots of great artists. And an exhibition of these artworks ended up traveling the world, going to New York, London, Berlin, Rotterdam, Chicago, and finally Paris. And she was this huge sensation and created this moment in art history that's kind of unprecedented, to have 50 portraits of the same person from the same year. I mean, there were like kings and queens, that maybe were portrayed by a dozen or 2 dozen artists over the course of their lifetime. But to have somebody who was basically a relative nobody, certainly not a world figure, to be portrayed that many times and by so many great artists and so many different styles of art. We have Cubists, we have Surrealists, we have Post-Impressionists, all giving us their take on her. It's really an extraordinary exhibition that has almost no parallel.
It seems that some of the artists were sincerely taken by her, and then others were a little bit more skeptical. Do you know anything about their reactions beyond what is presented in the book?
So, yeah, a couple of them were a bit more hesitant. One woman, when asked to do a portrait of her, said, "Oh, well, I've got all those canvases over there. Just pick up one of them and call it Portrait of Maria Lani. They look kind of like you." And so that was her way of dismissively turning down the project. And Picasso famously refused to do her portrait. He had something of a standing policy of, you don't call me, I call you, right? He picked who he wanted to portray. He didn't take commissions. You couldn't just go to him and say, do my portrait. So those are probably the two most notable artists to turn her down. And a couple more who did do her portrait kind of noted in their diaries, like, I'm not so sure what I think of this project, but what the heck, I'm going to do it anyway. But most of the artists actually just seem to have really been entranced by her and captivated. And the artists who did write or talk about their experience said that it was amazing and that she was an extraordinary figure.
Jonathan, you spent 2 decades researching Maria Lani. What led you down that long and winding rabbit hole?
I first came across her when I was doing my PhD. I was studying for my oral exams, where you sit for 3 hours and get grilled on every possible minor detail you could imagine. And so I was consuming as many books as I could, and just came across her at a footnote and was like, wow, like what an experiment, right? I needed to know more about her, but really didn't have the time to look into it until finally I was done with my orals and I was in Paris working on my dissertation on a different topic. But this being, Paris and libraries generally, they have these very old archives that you need to go through. Often you put in a request for something, but then it takes hours for them to actually bring out the book or the whatever that you need. They have to go find it somewhere and whatnot. And so while I was filling my time waiting for stuff to arrive, I would start poking around in their collections and in their index files and databases for information related to Maria. And just slowly over the years in between projects, it's been accumulating stuff on her, going through archives from Paris, Berlin, Poland, New York, all the places that she lived, and even some other places. It ended up being an obscure American university that had the screenplay that was finally made of her life that was written by Thomas Mann, the Nobel Prize winner, and never actually could become a film. Not yet, anyway. I mean, who knows? It could still happen, I guess. But so yeah, it was a long and winding road. And when I first started looking into her, there was really very little that was known and published about her. There were a few scattered remarks in memoirs from the period about her, mostly having to do with this idea that she was not a silent film star, but rather a con artist from Warsaw who had made off to America with all the paintings and quietly sold them off to unsuspecting American collectors and made a mint. And so that was the first thing I really wanted to look into, is that rumor, which I can't pronounce on it with 100% certainty, but I think was essentially false, that she was not a thief. She certainly exaggerated her resume and shaved 10 years off of her age, as actors and actresses are wanted to do, and acted like this movie of hers was like an actual thing rather than just the kind of figment of her imagination. Again, something that's pretty common among people in the cinema industry. And so while she misrepresented herself in a lot of ways in order to pull off this idea that she had, I don't believe that she ever actually stole anything. A lot of these rumors came out of the kind of vacuum that was left when she disappeared, right? So after this exhibition, nobody really heard from her again for another couple of decades until she died in 1954. That was when the rumor mill really started to get going. So when I started diving into the archives, there was very little solid information available about her. And I kind of had to start from nothing and figure out what was her real name, where was she really from, all these kinds of things.
I'm sure she would be pleased that all these years later, someone is still infatuated with her.
Yeah, we like to think so. We like to think that she feels like we won a little bit of justice for her, or at least continue, that maybe it would be enough for her that people are at least continuing to talk about her.
Yeah.
I feel like hopefully it's a love letter to her.
I mean, honestly, from an artist's perspective too, which I am not, but you are, Zach, I kept on wanting to see like a really good portrait of her, and then it just like left me wanting more and more. I was like, oh no, like her face is never like really there. And I thought that was kind of fun reading throughout the book.
We spent some months trying to figure out how we wanted to depict her. And I was drawing her full face and everything. And for some reason it just wasn't working, or I don't know, with the tone or something was off. And maybe what was off was the fact that we were showing too much, for this mysterious, figure that is Maria Lani. And we came up with the idea of just kind of always showing a fraction of her face, to the viewer. I think it was a clever device for the whole book.
I think it's also nice in terms of contrast, because all of the dudes in the book are really hideous looking.
I don't know what you're talking about.
Enjoying the show? Click like and subscribe. Zach, your drawings are meticulously rendered and have a wonderfully surreal and even grotesque quality. What was your approach to illustrating this story?
When me and John first teamed up with this, we first met at an art opening, and I typically do painting and drawing, but from way back in my childhood, I was doing comics and I was a fan of like animation. And typically I would do gross and dark things, but anyway, I was at this art opening and I met John's wife, and I was showing her some of my work on my phone, and she was like, "You need to meet my husband. He has a fantastic stories he's been researching. And so, yeah, John told me Maria's story, and then, yeah, we met at a cafe, and he dropped this pile of research materials, from birth certificate, death certificate, um, layouts of old towns, and, of course, tons of photography of Paris. And so I would just take that pile and just absorb as much as I could. Um, and always tried to feel like, I would be walking through the street of Paris. And that was kind of my approach. I was influenced a lot by like Masterpiece Theater, Looney Tunes, Pee Wee Herman, Gary Panter, who designed Pee Wee, is from the Underground Comics, and then got into like Ren and Stimpy. And I think like Looney Tunes and Ren and Stimpy had these close-up shots that were like very hand painted. Especially in Ren and Stimpy, they would totally try to gross us out. But like growing up, I had like a very strong reaction to these shots, and I always wanted to see more. And that's my meat and potatoes. That's what I grew up on, and that's what I always want to see more of.
I think it's been really interesting how you've taken those influences and also combined them with some of your fine art training, like intaglio prints and like bringing a kind of level of detail and shadow and chiaroscuro, but it's maybe unprecedented in that kind of underground style.
Yeah, I really developed my line work with intaglio printing. You draw on a copper plate with like a nail or something very tiny and sharp, and you will work your way rendering the figure or whatever subject you're working on. Um, and it's weird. Yeah, I also have like a fine art background, so I love like Caravaggio and um photography, like Sally Man. Like I like dark material, soft lighting, um, and also gross spaces.
Besides Maria and her husband, Maximilian Abramowitz, the other main character in the story is Jean Cocteau. Could you tell us about his involvement?
Yeah, so he quickly emerged as a figure of interest as I was doing my research. Looking at the early press reports about her arriving in Paris, he was the first person mentioned. He seemed to have been her earliest admirer and supporter, and I suspect that they kind of targeted him as someone who could be the key to kind of unlocking the Paris art world, because he was known for being that person, for being the person who knew everyone, right? That he sort of traveled among all the different circles, and fell. I would say he fell in love with her, but he was entranced by her, and he wrote quite extensively about his own experiences trying to portray her. So he's not known primarily as an artist, but he did make art. He's better known today as a filmmaker and playwright. But he did do several portraits of her and wrote extensively about that experience for the exhibition catalog, which we then worked his words into the book. And he then also, towards the end of her life and after her death, becomes her biggest detractor. What seems to have happened is that Maria Lani's husband, Max, was something of a writer, producer himself, and had this idea to buy the rights to one of Cocteau's plays and try to turn it into a radio play. And his plans for that never really panned out, and Cocteau ended up getting someone else to do some stuff with that material, and Max felt betrayed and ended up taking Cocteau to court and suing him because he felt that his rights were not being respected. And he ended up losing that lawsuit. But I think in the experience, Cocteau probably learned that Max and Maria weren't always exactly who they presented themselves to be, and his imagination kind of spun out from there. And I suspect that he sort of started the rumors about them being thieves and so on. It's so the earliest mentions I can find of that rumor are in his diaries. And it's very easy to imagine how he would have also been saying these things at cafes and to friends and whatnot, and it could have spread from there. All the later mentions of these rumors are all unsourced, and so it's hard to know where they came from. But that's my suspicion. But he made for a great addition to our story because they had such a tumultuous relationship, and he was just such a colorful figure. I mean, Zach, you got completely entranced by him. Do you want to say a little bit about him?
I didn't know much about John Cocteau, and yeah, I became obsessed with. I mean, he was like seems like a pioneer in mixed media. You know, he was doing films and plays and paintings. But I really reacted to him when John, he had these journal writings of John Cocteau's experience with Maria, and that was a real test early on of how me and John collaboration would work, because we kind of thought about the John Cocteau's, I call them the psychedelic pages. So yeah, because I'm reading John Cocteau's journal writing, and his experience with Maria, and he's riddled with anxiety and having a hard time dealing with her and himself. John was like, "Why don't you, figure out some pages with this stuff?" And so I was like, "Okay, I think I'm going to have some face melting, and the environment's going to change and everything." And I laid out these pages and showed John, and he gave the thumbs up. So I was like, okay, this would be a great working relationship.
Yeah, he comes across as a nervous wreck, a self-doubter, sort of a crazed person. I wonder if his fans, John Cocteau fans, have reacted in any way to the drawings or the depiction.
I haven't heard anything along those lines. I mean, I think most people acknowledge that, yeah, he was a bit of a hot mess. He was addicted to drugs, opium especially, and his personal life, was kind of one big train wreck, dumpster fire. I picked the metaphor you like. Life wasn't easy for him, but he managed to transmute a lot of it into some pretty amazing writing and drawings and films.
And yeah, we do try to make everybody a bit of a sympathetic character, no matter, how the dozen of flaws that they have, it's like, well, we can all relate to all of these people.
Maria and Max were con artists of a sort, but were also legitimately persuasive in getting 50 leading artists to paint portraits of Maria. How do you assess that project?
I think ultimately it's a really amazing thing that they pulled off, and I'm glad that they did. I think that artist models are generally not given enough credit for how much they contribute to the artistic process. They're seen as just the sort of tools, like the paintbrushes or whatever. But how they present themselves, how they shape the sessions and the work that comes out of them, I think is often undervalued. And her project is a great example of that, where she really took the reins and made this happen and gave us a fascinating art historical document that will, I think, be interesting for audiences, forever. And hopefully someday the exhibition could be brought back together again, and we could see all the portraits, or at least some of the portraits, together again, because you really get to see, since the model stays the same, you get to see really the individuality of each artist is cast into high relief. You see exactly what they brought. Of course, and I don't want to assume that she presented the same face to every artist in every session, right? I think that was part of her genius, was that she sort of showed each artist a different side of herself. And it's often, according to the artist, sometimes multiple sides of herself, all in the span of 5 minutes, right? That she was actually, an amazing actress. One of the things that Cocteau said about her after she died was, "Oh, she was no actress," right? But of course she was. Like, she fooled 50 of the most perceptive people, in Paris, at the time, people who prided themselves on being able to see through appearances, right, and having incredible acuity. So I think you gotta tip your hat to that kind of accomplishment. And ultimately, is basically a victimless crime, right? If we believe that she did not steal any portraits, and I could go into all the reasons why my research kind of shows that it's very unlikely that she did. Um, it's a victimless crime and ultimately just a kind of great coup. I'm really drawn to these stories of people who pull off these coups that kind of seem impossible. You wouldn't believe it unless it actually happened.
Speaking of her as a famous person who is painted and we know her by name, I'm just recalling Mona Lisa, right? Which Maria, Lani, Mona Lisa, there's some similarity with these names. I could be just shooting into nothing, but I wonder if she had that in mind, modeling herself after another famous person who was portraited.
Yeah, I did kind of wonder where that name came from, and I got a little bit of a hint once I finally found her real last name was Jelenowitz. So in the middle of that name, you've got Leni, right? So she kind of took the middle of her name and made it her whole name. Possibly just because it sounded more like a movie star name, possibly just perhaps to sound a bit less Jewish. I mean, I don't really know how she felt about her Jewishness. There are a few news reports from the late 1920s that do mention that she's Jewish, so I don't think she was like trying to hide it exactly, but maybe she was downplaying it. Maybe she was trying to leave that part of her life, which seems to have been fairly sad, behind. And then the irony being that in the 1930s, it kind of reaches back out and grabs her and forces her to pay attention to it again.
Your book sets the record straight on the supposed disappearance of Maria in 1931. You show that Max and Maria used their talent for sleight of hand to smuggle Jews out of Europe. How did you discover this?
There was this question in my mind for many years as to what happened to her, right? Why did she disappear? And then I came across this archive. It's called in French called the Fond de Moscou, so it's like the Moscow archives. Basically, when World War II came to a close, the Soviets seized all of these archives from France and brought them back to Moscow, and didn't return them to the French government until like 2004. And one of the things in this archive was the Paris police, all of their files. And so I started rooting around in these files to see if there was any trace of Max and Maria. In fact, they had a nice big chunky file in this archive. The police followed them over the course of many years through the 1930s, what they're up to. And what they were doing was what seems to have happened is that they started to get these sort of increasingly panicky pleas from back east, from friends and family, who were trying to flee west from persecution and needed visas, right? And were having trouble getting them. And Max and Maria founded essentially a fake nonprofit, a fake war veterans charity that, as far as I can tell, didn't really do anything for war veterans per se. What it did was raise money and then use that money to bribe French officials into granting visas to these Jews trying to go west. And this, according to the police, would basically consume their lives. Like from sun up to sundown, this is what they were doing all day, every day, is running this scheme. And interestingly, the police never busted them. I don't know if that's because they were also on the take or because they thought it was a noble enterprise, or who knows. But they were allowed to continue right up until they were chased out of France themselves. When Hitler invaded, they got out of there. They went to Portugal and got on a boat and waited out the war years in New York City. Max actually stayed there, but she returned to Paris to live out her last couple of years before she died.
What were the biggest surprises and challenges in bringing the story to light, both in terms of writing and illustrating it?
I'll go first, and then I'd love to hear your answer, Zach. I'd say for me, the biggest challenge was that I felt like the research was never done. I always wanted to know more. I especially wanted to find her memoir that I know she was working on when she died, but has disappeared. And wanted to, there are still mysteries. There are still gaps in her life that we don't know. And we allowed ourselves to speculate a little bit in the book, and on the website, the companion website, marialani.com, I kind of tease out some of the differences between the historical record and what we put in the book, where we had to speculate about, where we felt like that we could just leave those mysteries as mysteries without leaving the reader too frustrated. We tried to leave some of the mystery intact. With a historical figure, there's always going to be these things that we don't know and are going to be left to our imagination, for better or for worse. So yeah, that was the biggest challenge for me. How about you, Zach?
I mean, yeah, the biggest challenge is just, trying to get the environments and making the reader, the viewer, feel like they're walking down the street of Paris or Warsaw. But yeah, thankfully you provided me all that research material. And on my phone, I would research myself. I mean, I have a folder on my phone of like 2,000 images. Like there's like 20 images of like lamp and cars and trains. I wanted everything to feel appropriate for the time. And as for surprises, me and John wanted it to feel very personal and stuff. And when John would hand over journal writings or Max's poems to Maria, like that's really like what I responded to. And also had the most fun drawing those. Those were the most enjoyable parts to draw. And another surprise is, I mean, John is still getting emails about people finding her paintings, because some of them it's like, oh, they're missing, but then all of a sudden, like 3 weeks ago, John got an email from someone claiming one of Maria's paintings.
Yeah, whenever you study art history, it's always a bit of a struggle to get your hands on all the material, because a lot of stuff is in private collections and nobody knows where it is, or how to get access to it and how to research it. And so sometimes you just have to depend on luck. Of like, I got an email a couple weeks ago from a collector in Omaha, Nebraska, saying, oh yeah, we have one of the portraits of her. And I had only ever seen this in black and white, and they sent us this amazing color photo of it, which was just so fantastic to see. And yeah, if I'm ever in Omaha, I definitely want to go take a look at it. I've tried to see as many of them as I can in person, but only a few of them are in museums. Most are in private collections, so it's a bit challenging to get to see them.
Thank you so much, Jonathan and Zach, for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And to our audience, now back to your regularly scheduled lives. Amusing Jews is here to amuse you. If you like being amused, go ahead and click like and subscribe.